In the shadows of secrecy, they're concealing the shocking truth about the cost of living in Canada. It's soaring to unprecedented heights and inflation is skyrocketing, pushing housing prices into the stratosphere. In just the past 2 years, the rent has surged by a staggering 20% across the Canadian landscape, while the price of housing has skyrocketed by over $100,000 in a mere 12 months. But that's not the end of the story. Everything from gas prices to credit card debt, even groceries, continues its relentless ascent. Join us in this eye-opening expose as we delve deep into the heart of Canada's cost of living crisis and its devastating impact on the people. Over the course of the next few minutes, you'll witness a recurring theme, a theme of everything reaching unprecedented heights. Such is the intensity of the crisis that has gripped Canada. To truly comprehend the scale of this ordeal, let's begin by examining the population explosion that has swept across the nation. Canada is hurtling towards a record-breaking year in terms of population growth. In 2023, it is projected to welcome an astonishing 520,000 new permanent residents, a figure that shatters all previous records and represents a 20% surge from the 437,000 new citizens who arrived in 2022. An astounding 96% of Canada's overall population growth is attributed to immigrants who have journeyed from far-off lands in pursuit of their Canadian dream. Shockingly, Canada is even welcoming 3 times more immigrants per capita than the United States. Canada's population is growing faster than ever before, and this influx of people is making things even worse. One glaring example of this is the skyrocketing credit card debt. In 2023, Canada's credit card debt reached an all-time high of $107 billion, and the total consumer debt in Canada is a staggering $2.4 trillion. These numbers show how inflation is putting a heavy financial burden on Canadians. Many middle-class earners are trying to cut down their spending to reduce their credit card debt, but for low-income families, that's not an option. They have to take on debt just to make ends meet. A survey by MNP revealed that 52% of Canadians are only $200 away from not being able to pay their monthly bills, and this number has gone up by 6% in 2023. More than 1/3 of Canadians can't afford to pay their debt. Canadian households had an average debt of over $2,000 US dollars by June 2023, and the money supply from the Bank of Canada increased by 2.3%, which is a bad sign for the economy. Canadians are struggling to afford basic necessities like food. Prices for items like bread, beef, vegetables, and fruits has significantly increased in 2023. For instance, the price of chicken went up by 50% in the same year. The overall cost of groceries has risen by nearly 10% in the last year, surpassing expectations. Dalhousie University had predicted a 5 to 7% increase in food prices, meaning a family of 4 should have expected to pay about $1,000 more for groceries than in 2022. But the actual inflation rates were even more discouraging. Now let's tackle the biggest issue in Canada, the housing crisis. The housing shortage and rising interest rates have caused all housing-related numbers to soar. According to Rentals.com, the average rent in June 2023 is approximately $2,042, which is an all-time high, surpassing the previous record of $2,024 in November 2022. This demonstrates how things are rapidly getting worse. The June 2023 rent average is already 0.9% higher than it was in November 2022. In places like Cambridge and Kitchener, the rent for 1- and 2-bedroom apartments is increasing by 1.4% each month, which is quite alarming. In 2017, the average monthly rent in Canada was $1,172, but by 2023, it has risen to $2,290, a staggering 95% increase in just 6 years. This is making it extremely difficult for people, especially middle-class workers, to afford housing. If you can't afford to rent, you certainly can't buy a home. In 2011, the average house price in Canada was $348,000, but in 2023, just 12 years later, it has skyrocketed to $710,000, a more than 100% increase. In places like Toronto, the cost of homes has gone up by 160% in the past decade. Currently, an average 1-bedroom apartment in Toronto costs $550,000. This trend is not limited to Toronto. It's happening in other areas like Ontario and Vancouver as well. Canada is facing a major problem called the biggest real estate bubble in the world. The main issue is that the income of working-class Canadians isn't increasing fast enough to keep up with the rising costs of rent and housing. In 2023, an average middle-class Canadian family makes around $5,000 a month. However, the average monthly mortgage for a new home in 2015 was $1,400, which was only 28% of the average family's income. But in 2023, the average monthly mortgage is $3,500, which takes up 70% of a $5,000 income. With everything else getting more expensive due to inflation, it's really hard for that family to pay the mortgage and keep the lights on. So why is housing so expensive in Canada right now? The answer is quite simple. There's a severe shortage of housing, and the demand for homes is much higher than the supply. Canada needs about 6 million more houses to address this crisis. Building new homes is costly because landowners have to spend a lot, up to $300,000, just to get approval from the city. There are also higher interest rates on construction loans, and there's a shortage of construction workers. This leads to another problem for Canadians: underemployment. Canada has one of the most educated workforces globally, with about 57.5% of people being part of the working middle class seeking high-paying jobs to match their education. However, there aren't enough high-paying jobs, so many well-educated people end up in lower-skilled positions. This is especially challenging for immigrants, with about 34% of those selected based on their education and skills working in lower-skilled jobs. It's frustrating for them and leads to a significant percentage of immigrants leaving the country within 10 years. Adding to the challenges, a cost of living is so high that Canadians can hardly afford to put a roof over their heads, let alone pay their rising bills. 7 years ago, a $50,000 a year job was enough to cover expenses and afford a mortgage. But in 2023, it's insufficient, and owning a home seems impossible. To make matters worse, the government introduced a carbon tax, starting at 14 cents per liter, with plans to increase it to 61 cents per liter. This means that 40% of the money spent on gas will go to this tax. Overall, Canada's cost of living crisis is at its peak. Middle-class citizens are struggling to find solutions to survive, and the government has a lot of work to do to prevent Canada from becoming a dystopian nightmare.